Alright. Just sitting outside, watching the fireflies, having a pretty good night. Everything's pretty cool. For the book, last one, you know what it was. This one's going to be a little bit different from most of them in that I'm actually going to play uninterrupted about an hour's worth from start to, I don't know, whatever an hour is of the story. I got a new voice doing things, so it sounds a little bit better. You guys see any of the fireflies? Can I? They're somewhere around. They're around me. Trust me, you're gonna have to take my word for this one. But either way, that's it. So enjoy.
Chapter 1. Cassandra. Cassandra's bed has a humble wooden frame, made from the soft brown wood of the outer forest. She lay deep in slumber, her body adorned with a threadbare quilt she had stitched together from old fabric scraps. Despite its worn appearance, the bedding was perfectly warm and comforting, cocooning her in a swath of faded colors. A rickety wooden bookshelf stood against one wall, its shelves mostly empty except for a bit of dust, a few cobwebs, and a bowl which contained the remains of a fat little fish with no name. It had died yesterday, though its passing won't be of any great concern. It had lived a good life, and died with a full stomach. Why, it would still have had children, had it not eaten them as they were born. Tomorrow, she will take it out into the forest and offer it to the beetles as a show of thanks. A tiny gesture, considering the fact that she had ignored their warnings. The room would be an uncomfortable space, were Cassandra a bit older and a few inches taller. It was certainly small, with no space for even a window. On the opposite side of the room was a wooden desk, covered in ink stains and surrounded by scattered parchment. Her handwriting skills would never be considered an art form, but with time and a little patience with herself, she could both read and write. To be sure, there were words she does not know, nor would she recognize, but for a 9-year-old she would be seen as clever, if not above average, for never having any formal education. The floor was a mix of perfectly even tan wooden planks and a worn-out rug that had seen better days. It was the one thing in her room that she would always keep clean, as her father had once exploded into anger when he found it caked with mud. She wasn't one to neglect her responsibilities, however the night before had been difficult and she went to sleep as soon as she got to her room. She had left a trail of mud leading from the front door, and her bed sheets would take hours to clean, but that old rug seemed to be the only thing that bothered anyone. Her mother, Catherine, would often step in should Weslow become aggressive, but this time she just stayed quiet. It was her way of agreeing with him, and she hated it, but she knew it must have been important to the both of them. It was a simple mistake that ended with more than she cared to go through, so for everyone's sake, it was kept spotless. The pattern of intricate designs were long faded from years of use, but the overall color reminded her of bright red tomatoes, which had been on her shit list since before she could remember. Cassandra groans and turns over in bed. She can hear the sound of glass shattering and yelling through the heavy wood of the walls, but it had become common to her unconscious state, as something most usual within the house. Like the cracking of logs over a fire in winter or the sound of the rain crashing upon her small cottage in the woods, it was not enough to pull her out of her dreams. As far as she was concerned, the earliest moments of the morning centered on having a bear for a pet. It seemed her parents were away, and even though it was very small, she ran about the cottage, overturning furniture and altogether overreacting. Before the screams of the next room could register with her, Cassandra's thoughts were of how silly she was behaving towards a very friendly little bear. It was a foolish representation of herself, and she found herself immediately annoyed. But the space around her melts away as, finally, the real world begins to sink in. She can hear her father yelling unrecognizable words, and her mother screaming. Cassandra throws off the layers of patchwork that make up her sheets and runs towards the adjacent room, but her parents' door is shut. Even at the age of 9, she knows she could never move it an inch. The wood was different from most because it was almost as hard as stone. But still, the house shook as her father raged against whatever drunken irritation possessed him today. Catherine would often pull Weslow away in these moments, giving Cassandra time to go elsewhere of her own accord. The heavy doors became the armor her mother used to protect her until he eventually calms. But today, Cassandra has had enough. She pounds her small fist against the door and screams for Catherine, who can be heard sobbing. Time dragged on as Weslow slowly opened the door, but before she could spot her mother through the upturned furniture, fallen books and smashed artwork, Weslow pushes her to the ground. The look on his face took the fight out of Cassandra, and her voice caught in her throat. His rage seemed so out of control that his red and watery eyes reflected the smoldering embers of the fire that had lit the living room. "Get out," he says coldly, his tone flat and emotionless. Pulling her by the collar of her shirt, he opens the front door, and tosses her out like a disobedient pet, onto the cold and wet morning dirt. A small gathering of debris broke the worst of her landing, but she still fell hard and rolled side over side for several meters. Cassandra picked herself up, her knees scraped and her heart pounding in her chest. With a grimace plastered across her face, she dusted herself off as best she could. The cold, dry dust would work well enough to stop the tiny spots of blood that began to pool over the broken skin of her knees. Unlike a certain friend of hers, she had no skill for the tricks that could cast off dirt, or how to tell directions with nothing but a feather. Or even the skills of her friend Yeslin, who was slow to learn most things, but excelled at mixing herbs. The sort that could accelerate the rate at which small wounds heal, would be a useful one to pick up, and she reminds herself to ask about it when she sees her next. The sky was a dull, ashen gray, which cast its gloom over the clearing around her home. The weather perfectly complemented her mood, and she found herself feeling thankful the rains had passed by the time she made her grand arrival out into the world. No more than a few patches of grass grew so close to her house, and so Cassandra liked to think that her father poisoned the very ground with his presence. She looks up to her home, its dark blue wooden walls standing tall and imposing, while she could do nothing but shake her head to clear her thoughts. Today was just another addition to the list of crappy starts to what is usually a pretty good day. The sounds of earthenware containers shattering and furniture being destroyed was going to continue, but the house would never let the sounds escape. She had seen little in that brief moment through the open door, but it had told her everything she needed to know. Cassandra's small fists trembled with anger as she thought of her mother trapped in that kind of tempest. Weslow's face, contorted with fury, was etched into her memory. But her mother would endure, as long as Cassandra left and stayed out of the way. She knows he couldn't hurt her if she stood up to him, her friends have told her all about the way he gets. He stumbles into town, already reeking of alcohol, then continues from bar to bar until he starts a fight, eventually getting beaten and thrown into one of the hundreds of alleyways. Possibly, the only positive thing anyone's ever said about him was that he somehow managed to live so long, but Cassandra was not convinced anyone ever meant it as a good thing. Long stacks of blue logs made up her home, with wood that was impossible to harvest unless naturally fallen. While en route they would be as hard as stone. Nearly as hard as stone, meant that getting back inside would never work. It left a sickening feeling in her stomach, but if she remained inside she would only risk getting the worst of Weslow's anger. She walks to the back of her home, her bare feet atop the cold-packed earth sending shivers up her spine. But fortunately or not, this wasn't the first morning of its kind, and Cassandra was ready. There were never any sounds this close to her home. The massive trees prevented any substantial breeze from passing through, and the animals seemed to avoid the large clearing of their property. No birds with their morning song ever greeted Cassandra's arrival, but at the least, there would be plenty once she got closer to the forest. After moving a few carefully placed stones, she gathers a small pack of clothes from a box, wrapped in a brown scrap of fabric, and removes a small blue knife, found several weeks ago as she traveled through the forest. She stares at it darkly, and remembers her mother making her swear to never harm Weslow, even though she thinks it would be pretty easy to catch him unaware to end both their problems at once. She made the promise with blood, but it was what it took for Cassandra to begin her training, and she would never betray her mother's trust. The tiny scar on her thumb reminded her of that much. But still, you grow stronger every day, Catherine would say, and Cassandra knew it wouldn't be long before she would put a stop to her father's nonsense. Deciding to focus on getting through the forest, she takes the knife and cuts a strip of cloth from her pack. She takes a few small blue leaves and wraps them around the wooden blade, their leathery toughness making them a suitable sheath. She had to use every resource available to her, and so her clothes were also made from the forest leaves. Layers of them sewn together and treated in oils would retain their soft and supple nature, and a simple tunic design allowed her plenty of mobility. After pulling the clothes over top of her nightgown, she uses the strip to tie the bundled-up knife, just below her knee, before setting out into the forest. Chapter 2. Forest. The cool morning air wrapped around her, casting off any remaining haze from having woken up no more than a few minutes ago. The sky above was a tapestry of thin gray clouds, moving slowly as the rising sun peeked out over the horizon. It was going to rain again, but for now the crisp earthy smell was something to enjoy. Once she gets to the city, it would be very different. The forest always seemed to welcome her, with its ancient trees standing tall like sentinels, their branches reaching towards the heavens. The massive leaves above provided few patches of dappled sunlight, yet still it danced upon the forest floor, illuminating vibrant mosses and wildflowers that painted the landscape in a riot of colors. With each step deeper into the woods, Cassandra's senses heightened. She could feel the coolness of the forest floor beneath her feet and let out a small shiver. Her shoes were made of the leaves of the forest, tough, thin, light, supple, and waterproof, but at the sacrifice of warmth. She decided that she would set out for a run to warm up, and Cassandra takes off into a steady, though cautious jog. The softness of the moss clung to the tiny hairs of the fior leaves that cushioned her soles, but it also helped keep her steps silent. The occasional rustle of leaves, as unseen creatures scurried away, helped set her mind to task. She had learned to navigate the blue forest, modifying her path each time to evade the creatures that called this forest home. The forest floor bore evidence of their presence, tiny paw prints reminiscent of mice and larger webbed tracks that left deep, four-pronged gashes in the earth. Cassandra had adapted, randomizing her route to avoid the predictable patterns of these inhabitants. But today, a sense of unease settled within her. Her recent confrontation with Weslow still echoed in her mind, and his eyes, burning red with anger, haunted her thoughts. It was unlike anything she had experienced before. Break. There were a few tricks to getting by in the forest, and it took more curiosity than caution to figure them out. But even after years of moving through, there was always something new to discover. The smallest kinds of life seemed like a safe place to start when she first became curious, but she didn't expect that so much of her initial trips would be filled with following the lives of tiny blue-striped beetles. She couldn't stand bugs at first, and she'd get upset each time she found them in her hair or clothes, but they never seemed interested or bothered enough to bite her. They surely could, for protruding below their 3 sets of eyes were 2 sharp rows of mandibles, but it didn't take long for her to find out how they survive. For around 4 days a month the rain falls non-stop, making traveling through to town impossible. But after the great storms pass, the flood waters push the town's filth and trash into the forest, where it's broken down by creatures such as the little beetles. Each month they'll eat the garbage or bloated remains of the dead that gets washed in from the city. Within a few days they strip everything off the dead, leaving nothing but bones behind. It was a disturbing sight to be sure, at first. But after she learned that the various animal bones could be used for picking locks, she came to absolutely love the creepy little things. She overheard the older guild members saying that any lock worth picking will be warded against metal tools, but nothing could detect bone. That meant that each month she could collect enough to treat her fiends, and as the few dozen bones rattled in her bag, she was eager to meet up with them. Living in the center of the blue forest had moments of great peace, but it also cut Cassandra off from the entire world. She has no one she can speak to, no neighbors to visit, and no food stalls to beg from. But most importantly, her friends could never come here. She needed them in her life, so she wouldn't risk them being hurt. What's more is that they cared about her just as much. They didn't act or talk the same way around her as they did with everyone else, and it wasn't just because she had saved their lives. They always make time for her, they always want to hear about her training at home, the things she discovers in the forest, and to tell her their stories too. One was always in the middle of some silly new problem of gigantic proportions, with Cassandra getting roped in to help. Yet you might be forgiven for thinking that the other brought some manner of caution or maturity to the group, because for the truth of it, 19-year-old Yeslan was in many ways so much worse. A stolen item could be replaced and sometimes a person may want to see them beaten to a pulp, but Yeslan was a lot trickier when it came to getting what she wants. Though dangerous instances may be rare in comparison, it meant that when Yeslan needed help, things were already really bad. There was probably so much more than what they told her, but Cassandra understands that they have to do things to get by, and they're the sort of things they don't want her anywhere near. Break. Over time, Cassandra found that the blue bugs seemed to respond to her. This took quite a long time to notice, but eventually, they weren't in her hair anymore. At times a large group of them would rise up out of thin air, directly in front of her path, gathering en masse to the point where she would have to find another route through. On more than one occasion she had even gotten lost, only to follow a path of beetles towards where she needed to go. Not back to their nest or back where she came from, but as though they understood her intentions and were doing their best to help. Such behavior didn't extend far beyond little bugs though, and after the sun sets there was nothing that could help. Everything about the forest was hostile at night, down to the scattered red vines that sought to expose anything unnatural to the forest that happened to stop for more than a moment. They illuminate when disturbed in places where the sun cannot reach them, and at night. They were also why cutting a path through wouldn't work. They're hard to see and once severed, every attached section for 3 meters would instantly glow. Even if only for a moment, being exposed light that could draw out the worst kind of attention. With the light still piercing through the trees, this would be among the last chances she gets to be still until she reaches the other side of the forest. Squatting down to steady her breathing after her run, she closes her eyes to recall the events of that morning. Weslow reeked of alcohol, and there were some signs that he was recently in a fight. His shirt was torn, with a few dried brown blood stains trailing down his chest. He had some fresh bruises around his eyes and lips too. He got beat up, she whispered aloud. He's so fucking pathetic. There were times when his rage seemed to stem from something less clear though. Times when everything seemed fine, but her mother would send her away, sensing something must be off with Weslow. Those times were by far the worst. Her mother had to conceal her injuries with thick makeup or wear clothes to hide the purple swelling from broken bones. She never went anywhere, but she would still put on a show as though Cassandra couldn't tell what was wrong. Even if Cassandra couldn't tell by looking, her mother had never missed an opportunity to train her when she asked, which she did every single day. It would show in Catherine's movements, or if she only used one hand to fend off Cassandra's attacks. There was no way to comprehend it fully. Her mother had been training her in self-defense since the age of 4, and now, on the cusp of her 10th birthday, Cassandra knew she possessed the strength to defend herself. Her mother had no reason to endure such abuse. She could overpower Weslow, effortlessly. Shaking off her contemplation, Cassandra became acutely aware of the need to press on. There was nothing left for her back home right now. With renewed determination, she resumed her journey, knowing she had no more than a half hour's time until she reached the outskirts of the slums. Finally, a glimmer of familiarity emerged, a small stream she had previously crossed farther to the north. With a sense of relief, she decided to follow this direction. She estimated it would take only another 10 minutes to reach the city. However, as she crossed the stream and ventured no more than a few meters in, her heart sank. The fog was gathering at an alarming rate and the sound of the stream completely disappeared. Even so, With an idea of the direction she has to go, she decides to press on. Chapter 3. Red Lake. Pressing past massive leaves and slipping through tightly packed trees, Cassandra's feet suddenly felt as though they had been kicked out from beneath her. She stumbles forward, all sense of equilibrium lost as she spills down an incline. She touches down hard onto her back, her head hitting hard against a stone that lay just under the mossy surface. Cassandra's head was still spinning as she stood up, the muscles in her back screaming at the effort. As her vision clears, Cassandra's mouth drops open in alarm. She was surrounded by a hazy white fog that poured out from within the very earth, parting to reveal a blood-red lake, stretching out into infinity. Sitting at the water's edge, their feet dangling below the surface, was a boy not much younger than Cassandra. An instinctual urge to call out a warning surged from within, but she immediately clamped both hands over her mouth, muffling any sound. She dropped to her knees, keenly aware of the stillness that enveloped the water's surface. Something was terribly wrong. Ensuring she remained hidden, Cassandra maneuvered side to side, inch by inch, cautious not to disturb the individual vines beneath her feet for too long, until she found better cover. Minutes ticked by in eerie silence, and just as doubt started to seep into her thoughts, the piercing sound of a man's voice shattered the tranquility of the surroundings. It came from across the lake, so Cassandra took that moment to scramble over to the closest tree that could afford her a better and safer view. It didn't take long for the yelling to get closer, the fog seemingly guiding her sight, as the only clarity she could see across the lake was a single spot, where before long, a man, eyes wide with frenzy, appeared yelling, "Please, come back." The fog thickened around the boy at the lake's edge, but at the man's words a new voice emerged. "I'm over here, Dad. Help me, I'm scared." Cassandra's mind reeled in terror. This wasn't right. The voice of the boy emerged through the fog, but the figure at the edge of the lake had still not moved at all. This was a trap, and it wasn't meant for Cassandra. The man, distraught as only a loving parent could be, sees the childlike figure and his words of comfort come pouring out effortlessly. This man wasn't Weslow, this was a good man. This was over. The water only rose to his waist, but halfway across, the man seemed to struggle. The mud had ripped the shoes off his feet, pulling him by force with every step he takes. He stops for only a moment, his energy draining rapidly. He still calls to the child, still yelling words of comfort. "You'll never have to be scared again, I will get you home safe, I will save you." But he has stopped for too long, and now the vines within the water begin to explode into radiant light. The water begins to swirl around, and from within the whirl emerges the form of a woman, her body dripping the glowing red water of the pond as though it were blood off the fangs of a beast. Cassandra was frozen, her eyes widening in horror. She wanted to scream, but the sound was lost to her as the billowing in white cirrocumulus wisps threatened to pull Cassandra in with its force. Within seconds the fog had gathered into a sphere, encapsulating the man and now lifting him above to water to stand at equal height with the creature. "Run!" Every fiber of her being screamed at Cassandra, but she couldn't. The fear had its grip. "Run!" Again the words tore through her mind, but it made no difference. The maddening dance of mist began to rip at the man, slicing away chunks of his flesh as his screams burned into Cassandra. Clasping her hands over her ears did nothing to silence his agony, but the sound was enough to return a fraction of her senses. Looking down, she sees that the red vines had wrapped tightly around her left ankle, and were beginning to give off a light that drew her into the depths of despair. Panic surged through her and her entire body was trembling while the light continues to spread, as if to say, "You're next." She takes the small knife off her leg and managed to quickly cut herself free, not caring in the slightest that she sliced herself in the process. Her last glance back came as a matter of instinct, and what she saw would never fade in its clarity for the rest of her life. The vortex of fog was filled with blood, the man was nothing more than the gore within, save for one thing. The sphere lifts above the creature's form and bursts, its arms stretched above its head in welcome as the blood rains down upon it, and within its hands, was the man's heart. Branches whipped at her face, leaving scratches, and every stone and vine caused her to stumble, but she kept running. The screaming in her mind wouldn't stop, forcing her to review the scene over and over. The warmth of the man's voice calling for his child, the screaming, the way the creature seemed so close to her kind, the sound of the blood bursting forth and splashing into the lake. There was no order to what happened, just relentless flashes with increasing clarity for every instance that played on repeat. The man's face agonizingly contorted in pain, the creature's black eyes twisted up into an expression of ecstasy, and now she sees, his heart had still been beating even while the rest was ripped apart. She didn't stop running until she could see the trees returning to the brown that indicated the worst was behind her. She could now feel the wetness of the blood on her face as she touches her cheek, but though the damage wasn't significant, the sight of her own blood returned her to that moment. The damp earthy smell in the air around the lake, the vines with their red glow, and now the blood on her hands, that may not even belong to her. With her flight of survival flooding her mind, she had relaxed for only a moment before the memories came flashing back into her reality. Clenching her hand to her mouth, she couldn't stop her body's violent reaction. The vomit pushed through her fingers and the tightness in her stomach forced her to her knees. Releasing the rest of her sickness took the air from every inch of her lungs, and she rolled on the ground, thrashing her filth-covered fingers against her throat, wordlessly pleading for air to return to her. The light begins to fade from her eyes, but she has just enough sense left to hear the only sound she needed. Fuck. Kid. No. What the fuck happened to? And despite the rest of the words fading into oblivion, Cassandra, tears streaking down her face, managed a small smile before losing consciousness. Chapter 4. Garliette. Sister Garliette sleeps in a room located closest to the gardens, which she feels has its share of positives and negatives. The room looks about the same as all the rest, however it did have its share of unique qualities. It may have originally been a washroom for as much as she knew, however hundreds of years ago when the grounds were new. Her window may have been a mural depicting some grand moment, perhaps. But during her time here, it has been no more than a rectangular hole in the wall. The grand mural was far from the end of her fantasy, as quite often she would be lost in thought, imagining the world as she would have liked it. Something calmer, most certainly. The weather, for one, was easily predictable if your guess was that it'll pour, then dry up, and then pour again. The problem was that there would be no more than a handful of minutes before the change would happen. The rainfall could clear, dry, then rain again a half a dozen times a day. Many of the old buildings that are attached create a system for people to travel through to avoid the rain. Within these systems you'll find everything you would expect in a market. Food, lodgings, bathrooms, misc. But you'll also see how the world functions at this level. The slums are similar to Jersey City because of the way the buildings flow. Within a single row of buildings, hundreds of people could live, farm, and create an ecosystem within their communities. But you also have the streets, which would extend from the buildings into tent-like houses and trade stalls. But otherwise the actual architecture is a very old, run-down, version of the same buildings from today. As you move up the mountain, the buildings start to resemble castle and village life, but so old and repurposed that there isn't much way to pinpoint it to a specific time period. Being the first to know when the storms are passing through, wasn't her most favorite feature. With the wind blowing hard enough to make the rain fall nearly horizontal through the opening, she usually wakes up cursing, with her sheets half wet. Whatever had filled the stone window had been destroyed hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. Today though, it wasn't a storm that woke her, but a voice. Her eyes flutter open as she absent-mindedly wipes her face of sleep debris, and she sees the first light of the day shining in. After a great yawn overtakes her, she listens. The singing is still there, but it's far too early for the children to be awake. Perhaps one of the rats have snuck out. Oh well, she thinks. There was no great urgency to inspect the sound, as it rang through the gardens. Most places in the Red House were safe for even the youngest of children to enjoy freely. Garliette slowly gets out of bed and pulls her outfit on over her nightgown. She was about to set a pot of water on to boil, but a thought occurred to her. That voice sounds so young, but none of the little ones know how to count so well. He goes all the way up to 20, she thinks, before hearing him start to describe what colors he must be seeing. Red, orange, white, blue. He must be in the center of the garden, where all the different flowers come together. She tosses her earthen cup to the ground. It was no great thing, as it crumbled harmlessly underfoot. It was the last of a batch she had made less than a week ago, but she would shape and fire a dozen more by the end of the day. For now, she was nearly frantic with excitement, and another broken cup didn't matter. Today, a new child may have arrived at Helu's Diem. A small child by her guess. 4, maybe 5 years old, with a clear, beautiful voice, who was singing every word. It was a boy, which flitted through her mind as a negative, as she was hoping the next would be another girl, but the thought was swept away and replaced with her image of him as she quickly made herself the very least bit presentable, before throwing open her door and running toward the gardens. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I once caught a fish alive. From the moment she left her room, his voice was lost as she ran down the oppressively lightless hallway, but before she could pick it up again, the worst possible thing that could happen, happened. Rebecca had also woken up and stuck her head outside her door in time to hear Garliette charging toward the gardens. Her eyes grew wide as they quickly adjusted to the darkness, and understanding became evident. Still in her frumpy white sleep cottons, with her face covered in a thick green herbal mask, she made her move. Rebecca had no window in her room, so she could not have heard the boy, but everything about Gal's demeanor told her enough. Not again, you evil witch! She yelled as she burst out of her room, positioning herself to intercept Garliette. With a pass of her hand, the muddy face mask was swept away and thrown to the center of the hallway. Out of my way! Gal yelled. But Rebecca would not back down. Most of the children staying on the grounds were in their middle years, a stubborn time where they do their best to ignore every ounce of advice. There were a few, no more than several months old, but their care was decided upon by vote and tally. For Galliette to be in such a state, meant that they must be between 2 and 6 years old, she thinks. But in the rare instance a child should be found by a sister, she would be in charge of the child for a week, and if compatible, possibly for months beyond. Answer: due to the rectangular hole in her wall, Garliette has been able to spend with them what most would consider to be the cutest and most influential stage of their lives. Where every day is a fun new adventure as they look to her for help in their new environment. Where her guidance will live within them, forever. Her room gave her the advantage here, but she had to get past Rebecca. If I could just time it right, Gal thinks. Becca will only have one chance to stop me with one of her silly little magic tricks, but which one? She had 5 that Gal knows of. She can see clearly in the dark, but that wouldn't help her avoid getting bowled over, she thinks, as Rebecca is much smaller than her. But Garliette, unfortunately, isn't the quickest thinker, and so her plan came much too late. Rebecca simply placed a single finger against the wall, and it was done. Quick as lightning, a bright, thin white line crackled and traced itself down the wall and flashed across the ground towards the bit of mud she had thrown. Garliette couldn't have seen it. Rebecca was 2 steps ahead of her, and for just a second, the ground had become like ice, causing Garliette to let out a surprised yelp as gravity began to make little sense. But this wasn't over quite yet. Garliette had built up enough momentum that no matter which magic she used, her body would still crash hard into Rebecca, taking them both to the ground in a tangle. Each tried to get up, but the other kept pulling her back down. See, you're not so clever, I knew you'd try something like this. Yet, you're still on the floor. How was that your plan? It did work, and you didn't even hear the boy. So I'm right. This is unfair. You can't claim another child when others are waiting. I won't allow it. Allow. When did you become so important? And it's only for the first week. You're being dramatic. Let go. Absolutely not. Help. Help me. Anyone. Rebecca yelled at the top of her voice, in true dramatic fashion, all the while locking her arms around Gal's waist. Mere moments later, the hallway was lighting up and filling with giggling women, who all clearly understood the situation, and in the distance, she could hear the young ones waking up. It was time to give up. Fine, fine, I said. Get off of me. You are absolutely shameless. What's going on? There's a new boy in the garden. How old is he, Gal? I couldn't see him, but I'd guess 4 or 5. I heard him singing his numbers and colors. Singing. The matron pushes past Garliette, with everyone in tow. The look Garliette gave to Rebecca would have to be revenge enough. But as they got to the gardens, there was no child to be seen. Fengia took the lad to the men's kitchens. Brash will know if the boy stands hearty and hale, and after that they'll bring him over to the women for coddling. A cold smirk of disappointment ran across more than a few of the women's faces, as this was a sign to scatter. Rebecca shook her head at Gal, waved hello to Trader Grellis, then began the walk back to her room. Unlike most of the few men allowed into the house, Grellis wasn't there to court one of the residents. He was a longtime trader whose family had sold and supplied the house for generations. This, the 6th of his line to take up the kindness, was much less the rugged man than his father. And for a good reason. Grellis Senior the 5th was more of an adventurer than trader. The man couldn't sit still, and he pushed the limits of his journeys as far as he could, bringing the household more tales than fresh food. They would never complain, but the newest head of the family, they felt, was nothing less than a blessing. Food, clothing for all ages, and supplies to the point where they had to decline at times due to lack of space. Grellis VI, you see, loved every aspect of being a trader. His work was more than his legacy, but a way to help others become self-sufficient. And nothing showed that quite as well as the woman he calls his wife. Where's your better half? She took off to the slums again, said something about the game those rats play. I don't remember the name, but she took a bag of those pressed leaf spheres they toss about. Will she be all right? My girl knows how to handle herself. Besides, they know her face is a good one, and the people down there would kill for a kindness. Sorry to the one who tries to take her away from that lot. But enough of your niceties, go on and ask about the boy. How old is he? Ha ha, you're as obvious as the weather. He's 3 years old. How do you know that? He told me. He speaks. Quite a lot, in fact. Nothing like you and me having a chat, but if you can follow his mind a bit, you'll see what he means. Wait, but where did he come from? Do you know that? I do not. Found him sitting on that patch of grass I planted a few years ago, naked as a bird and having a bit of a song. Which grew in wonderfully. You know, I got the seeds for that garden from. Her expression soured towards the change in topic. Ah, never mind. You only have ears for the lad I see, and I don't blame you. Charming, wouldn't do the boy justice. I doubt the matrons will keep the boy for less than a month before saying he's clear to be amongst the sisters. But don't believe, I put him in some fresh clothes after getting a diaper on him, and he's as healthy a boy as I've ever seen. They wouldn't. I'm mostly pulling your leg. Everything about the boy is true, but it's more likely they'll want him making his introductions sooner than later. He's gonna be good to have around. Thank you, Grellis. Go on. Ah, but first, I nearly forgot, take this to your man Yaston, he says as he pulls a dusty old book from his pack. The child had me forgotten that I was holding on to this. Of course. She didn't know why, but as she waved goodbye to Grellis and walked closer to the men's kitchen, she began to feel nervous. She was awkward when turning down her fair share of advances, but they weren't the sort to persist. Honor for the men meant believing that any of them could be reconsidered even after having been refused. They would remain respectful at large, but the kitchens were a different story. There were no classes for the young to attend, and they could leave at any age should they decide. No adults were allowed to press their knowledge, so they used other means to gain their interest. And for the last few years, the young were most in agreement that the food they ate during their lessons with the men was better by far. Entering the kitchens would be a hassle, but she would deal with it. She doesn't think that either of the two who've pledged themselves to her would be there. Joran would be preparing survival activities disguised as games for the young who were near the age of confliction. He would often consult her whilst devising these elaborate exercises, always unsure of whether a fun activity had taught enough or whether a serious lesson was fun enough. Like the others, he was in his own way perfect. Taller than her by a hand, with a lean and muscular build, one would be forgiven for assuming he thought of nothing more than his own reflection. Nothing at all like Yaston, who persisted in looking as though he most recently tumbled down a hill. He was quite charming when he wanted to be, but he loved nothing more than to collect and restore the crumbling works of literature that the trader Grellis would sometimes stumble across. How she wound up with a pair of brothers as options was the talk amongst the other sisters for a time. But for the truth of it, she had come to consider each as dear to her. But they wouldn't be there. Instead, Varian the Hungry, a younger man to the house, lingered beyond the entrance to the underground men's kitchens. They've kicked you out again. I know what you're doing. She'll try to talk to you, they said, all nice and casual. Then before you know it, she'll have you in her pocket. I haven't a clue what you're talking about. Who told you that? So you're going to stop me from entering then? Not at all, go ahead. I'm a man grown, so they really have no business putting me on guard duty over the silly pissing contest they play with the women. What about learning how to cook? I heard Brash wanted you helping out. He assumed that my work with blades would do well in the kitchens, but it's not for me. Why not teach the young? There's plenty of room for further education, and the times aren't getting any easier. Best not, or we'll have the lot of them throwing spoons against the walls by sundown. Then I'd actually feel bad during a scolding from Brash. He's far too serious. If it were up to me, let the children throw. Spoons, did you say? Why spoons? What madman puts a blade in a child hand and tells em to toss it? Best get the aim down first, safely, ya know. Oh right, you see. You already sound like a teacher. Let the rats throw spoons or whatever. Then they can learn how to mend it and how to fix a wall as well, ha. I'll tell Grellis we need some supplies and I'll have a group for you by tomorrow. That way Brash shouldn't have to yell, and when you're dead and gone the little ones will keep your lessons alive. Everyone wins. Bring food. Did I just agree to something? I'm still in range to last a good while on the hunt. Most of the old ones would drop dead the second they left the grounds, so I'll stick to what I'm good at while I still can. Better not let them hear you call them old. Still, tomorrow you'll teach what you can, it won't take long, right? The idea ain't hard to understand, it's just practice, really. Perfect. So 1 hour and then you can grumble off to your hunt. You know we get more than enough supplies with Grellis as trader. I know, but you can never have enough money put away just in case, and food's the best way to get some. I've spent time as a raider. It's wise to have your own paid men to keep things calm should the Red come knocking. This place has only known peace since I've been here, and I'd prefer it stayed that way. Thank you, Ver. Put in a good word with Rebecca for me, will you? Oh, and they'll ask what happened to me. What should I tell them? The truth, of course, that I was no match for you at all. A chorus of noise assaulted her all at once. The sound reminded her of the battle arcade the warrior men set up for the young ones. Nothing at all like what one would expect from a kitchen run by Brash. Quiet when at work, he was warden and executioner of any who would disrupt his flow. A state the kitchen women would often compare to a function of their own biology, mocking him as best they may. For what else could they do? The man will cook for everyone except the adult women, a historical first for the house, leaving the other men to handle preparing ingredients and forging the occasional worn-out plate or cup. The women's kitchen became more of a meeting room for discussion or gossip than necessary for the running of the grounds. Though less than 50 rats, the 5 women who've chosen to run the kitchens used to struggle to feed every age every meal, let alone have time to manage lessons for the lot, and wash the clothing of the 22 girls under their own care. Before he arrived, the meals were very often a test of patience. Some of the younger ones would always end up refusing a meal, and the older children would pick at their food with very little enthusiasm. Instead, they would socialize, with childish pestering leading to fights among those closest to leaving the grounds that would leave the floor littered in the soft and crumbly remains of their cups and plates. Firing new ones every meal was exhausting for everyone. But now, you would hear nothing but the sound of food being devoured. No longer did the little ones complain, nor did the older ones have time to argue. They would finish their meals and go off with renewed drive toward whatever stood before them that day. Perhaps what insulted the women the most was that Brash had gotten to Trader Grelis. Under normal circumstances, Gal would have refused to believe that any of them could keep something to themselves. They had never kept secrets, as though the idea itself was unfathomable. Grelis III was said to go so far as to answer questions by singing outlandishly long and detailed songs and poems about how she learned the information. It was known to everyone that if you had something to keep hidden, you should never tell it to a trader. She thinks the saying must have originated with Grelis I, but to the point, Grelis VI would not share the ingredients he collected for Brash. We go way back, and I owe him a life debt. He saved our eldest from a bad spot, and he's been a good friend to our family for many years. I know how he is about his food, so I can't say nothing more. It would be much simpler if the head of the women's kitchen were of a softer temperament. Upon meeting Brash for the first time, the man had prepared a few meals as a courtesy, but she chose that very moment of goodwill to offer very harsh critique of his dishes. She would think of herself as consumed with regaining her position as best in the house, but it was clear to everyone else that she was completely in love with the man. But from the bumpy beginnings, things have only progressed negatively. As Garliette moves down the short hallway, it occurs to her that she's lightly pressing one foot upon the ground before the other. What's gotten into me, she thinks before straightening her back and clearing her throat. Her intention was to announce herself and demand they show the boy to her, but a loud, hum, behind her nearly made her jump out of her skin. With her vision finally adjusting to the dim light within the hallway, she turns, only to find herself blinded again. No bother having Tar dress down Virion if it's you. What mission did you press upon him? How does your mad beard not shed throughout the entire kitchen? She says, as she takes a step away to disentangle herself. Because it knows better. Answer or I'll tell your pretty brothers in perfect detail how I caught you sneaking in here like you meant to make off with the child in a flour sack. He'll be teaching a class in the morning, she says in a mumble. It's only an hour, but more urgently I must inform you that he called you an old one. I am old. His lack of respect is mutual in any case. How a man could throw a blade makes zero bloody sense to me. But you did walk right by me without a single notice, so nothing seems impossible anymore. But I'll make a cook of him if it kills him. Your passion is an inspiration, now. Can I? No. Go away. But a grin spreads itself upon his face as he says, we've already named him. No, you did not. You're right, it's more truthful to say your man Grelis named him. I'll kill him. You won't. And he didn't do it with intention in any case. Says, make sure the lad's hearty and hale, and since then when we ask the boy's name he keeps singing the words, hearty and hale. He seems born with the hearty bits, so our wish for the lad is that he be hale. Garliet says, I am defeated. Today is proving to be irksome. Do you intend to keep him with the men? We could, and probably should, but this turn we've got men better suited for war than childcare. No one would deny that the system you women have done up with, Avenue kept those rats alive for years longer than most of 'em out there. You mean it? I would think a man of war would find our way too loosey-goosey. I don't know the last words, but I get your meaning, and yes. It should not work, and I don't know how it does, but they leave here strong. ... If you let me at least see the boy. Hale. Yes, I will help you with your heart condition. My what? Miss D12, I believe. What can you do? A lot. Now let me in. I do not trust your mind. What exactly will you do? I'll tell her the story of how you named the boy. But I didn't. I'll not have you lie to. You'll just have to tell the story to her, properly, over dinner. I doubt that she often hears such things about you, and I couldn't, not over dinner. When she looks at me, my strength fails. I'm saying I'll figure something out. She's just not the easiest to talk to. Go in, but we have a deal. I swear to it. Thank you, brah. Get a move on. Okay, all right. Pulling open the door to the kitchens could only be described by Galliette, as though she were entering the heavens. The room was a spotless and shining white, and the reflection of the tube lights running along the ceiling instantly blinded her as she entered past the pitch-black hallway. It was only for a second, but the noise within made it feel longer. She blinks a few times and she comes to see 5 men staring at her with shit-eating grins on their faces. Galliette looks from corner to corner of the room, and doesn't see the boy at all. Before her mouth could open, the meme broke out in laughter from the absolute dumbfounded expression on her face. And then they sang. Hearty and Harley, Hearty and Hale. They repeated the words with sharply rising and falling inflection, changing between a soft, almost girlish pitch to a low, deep rumble. Where is he? Brash, get in here please. Ah, that was quick. Your man Yaston took the lad through the underground to the matron then, it seems. I was told he was on the way. Brash couldn't have known, they left seconds ago. Deal's a deal. Fuck, any luck I could go through and... None. Ain't no light down there, and we got no one to spare tar guide ya. Normally we wouldn't take a lad that young through, but when we heard Yaston he ran right into the tunnel. Yars has got him, but it doesn't seem to bother him a bit. The dark, I mean. What was he like? Is telling you a part of this deal I heard you making with the big man. It is not, Brash says. I got it, I'm going. Break.